proof is there. The proof is out there. Christ is king, and every knee will bow.
Now that's a bit of a problem.
Welcome back, everyone, to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a video from the channel Aspiring Christian, where an intrepid theist that I'll simply call AC claims to have shocking proof that Jesus actually performed miracles.
Somehow I doubt that.
Now, I know he probably should have used the term evidence instead of proof, because I'm not entirely certain how maths can get you to the biblical miracle claims being absolutely true, but I think we get what he means by that. So let's go ahead and dive in and see exactly what this evidence is and why he thinks it's so shocking.
Hey, Christ is king, every knee will bow. You know, scholarly skeptics of today.
Well, that was something.
While I wouldn't normally recommend kicking off a video with a stream of consciousness clip, I do realize that everyone's kind of got their own way of doing things. But remember, AC, just because the line of reasoning in your head is coherent to you, does not necessarily entail that it will be coherent to all of us.
Atheists working in universities and first century Jews who didn't believe in Jesus and Christians all have one key thing in common.
Interesting. I'm very curious as to what the key thing that an atheist, a first century Jew, and a Christian of today all have in common. Are you sure this isn't the start to a bad joke, AC?
After examining the evidence, they have accepted that Jesus did indeed perform miracles.
Wow, okay, not exactly sure how you came to that conclusion. First, I don't personally know of a single atheist who would accept the claim that Jesus performed miracles as absolutely true, and I would hazard that you don't either. And don't think for a second that it wasn't obvious that you sliding in the working in a university descriptor there was anything more than a subtle backhand to any atheist who doesn't have a college education or does not work in higher education. Second, not all first century Jews accepted that Jesus was descended from God or that he was a prophet. Many rejected the claims that both he made and others made about him. Also, we don't have direct access to that historical time period. So in reality, your claim is literally based on a claim that someone else wrote down. That some obscure first century Jew believed that Christ performed miracles, which is nothing more than hearsay. And third, of course modern Christians believe that Christ performed miracles, even though the only evidence to support such events are anecdotal claims in one singular source, and only exists as extra-biblical evidence from people who were repeating the claims that they'd heard others make. But I mean, come on, that's why they're Christians.
Getting into the evidence, German New Testament scholars, Rudolf Bultmann.
Okay, before you dive into your whole evidence thing, AC, I want to make sure that something is really clear. You're going to claim that the propositions contained in an ancient book that Jesus Christ performed miracles are true because an extremely conservative German Lutheran who claimed the miracles were true was quoted in a book written by a parachurch evangelical and his son who also claimed the miracles are true. I honestly don't think it needs to be spelled out for you, AC, that the number of times that a claim is repeated has no bearing whatsoever on its veracity. I know how much you love that particular book from the McDowells there, bud. I mean, it's quite apparent by how often you reference it in your videos. But you'd think that a video entitled Evidence for Jesus' Miracles would have some evidence in it.
Conceded that Jesus performed acts that people interpreted as miraculous. Scholarly skepticism has become surprisingly muted in recent years. Of course, we are in Evidence for Jesus by world-renowned Christian apologist Josh McDowell, who was once an atheist, who changed his mind after studying the evidence for Christ and his resurrection.
Hey everyone, Editing JL here. So there was an important point here that I completely forgot to cover, and that was this claim from AC that Josh McDowell was an atheist who converted to Christianity after finding evidence to support it. In actuality, McDowell, in his own words from a biography that he wrote back in 2005 that appeared on his personal website, stated that he was an agnostic while he was at Kellogg Community College in the late 1950s, and after attempting to write a paper that disproved the historical evidence for Christianity, he says he instead found evidence to support it, and thus he converted. What AC leaves out, though, is that McDowell never once, over the length of his entire career or his over 150 published books, He never parses out exactly what that evidence was, by what methodology he was able to confirm it, or how he eliminated the possibility that his interpretation of the evidence could be incorrect. In other words, Josh McDowell made a claim about himself that he's never backed up, and AC here is eating it up as though it's gospel truth, demonstrating a glaring break in his epistemology. Now hey, back to the video.
Of course, his son, Dr. Sean McDowell.
Yeah, for all their blustering, the McDowells don't actually have any evidence that indicates that the propositions about Christ's miracles are true. What the McDowells are essentially doing is an analysis of the Bible through the lens of historical and legal proofs. And they do this in order to artificially prop up the authenticity of the text and the divinity of Christ. Which of course also implies that they are starting from a position where they are assuming the existence of their God and the truth of the Bible, but that's an issue for another time. The primary problem here is that arguing for the existence of what amounts to an Iron Age Palestinian David Koresh who was executed for heretical teachings is one thing.
He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy.
And arguing that the claims that this particular individual was supernatural and performed supernatural acts are true is entirely another, as the claim regarding this individual's existence is essentially a historical one and comes from a single source. It's essentially rendered impossible to bridge the gap from the existence claim to the supernatural claims without a complete and total suspension of one's critical faculties and diving headlong into that empty pool we call faith.
Who does have a popular channel here on YouTube.
As of the time of this recording, Sean's roughly 14-year-old channel sports about 207,000 subscribers. And that kind of makes sense, given that he is a senior lecturer at Biola University, which is a private non-denominational evangelical university located in La Mirada, California. He constantly runs around the country giving lectures and seminars about his method of apologetics, and he's a fairly established author in the evangelical Christian circle. It's also of note that he's tangentially connected to those evangelicals over at Stand to Reason, which includes the likes of Tim Barnett and Greg Kuchel, who themselves are tied into the Stint College Evangelical Outreach Program, which itself has ties to individuals like Kirk Cameron through the Todd Becker Foundation. So yeah, his reach in the non-denominational evangelical community extends pretty far.
But the reason that contemporary scholarship has swung in the direction of acknowledging that Jesus performed miracles is simple. The evidence is significant.
Well, biblical scholarship holds that Christ did indeed perform miracles based solely on the claim alone, because, as is often conceded, the entire issue is a matter of faith. But the McDowells argue that there is actual evidence that backs up the claims in the Bible. So let's see what the McDowells present as their evidence, and then let's see how AC interprets what they present.
One thing of note is that his critics of his day never said the guy wasn't doing miracles. They never said he wasn't casting demons out. They never said he wasn't healing people.
Well, apart from the whole thing about Christ being unable to perform any kind of miracles within his own hometown, because apparently his God power was somehow limited by those individuals' unbelief, the Bible itself doesn't offer any refutations of Christ's miracles, nor would you expect it to, as that could potentially harm the narrative that Christianity is selling to people. Extra biblical texts like the Talmud claim that the miracles that Jesus performed weren't actually miracles, but were a result of black sorcery. But of course, neither of these are evidence because the authors of the Bible and the authors of the Talmud never witnessed any miracles themselves, in fact, never even met Christ, and were merely repeating the stories that other people had told them. As both texts are essentially hearsay, neither one counts as sufficient evidence to support the truth of the Christ miracles claim, because essentially they're both just collections of the claims themselves.
Instead, we'll find in Mark 3:22, Matthew 9:34, Luke 11:15, after Jesus had removed a demon, performed an exorcism.
This, of course, is what happens when you attempt to use the source of the claim to validate the claim itself. The problem presented here for both UAC and the McDowells is that you're operating off of the fundamental presumption that the Bible is inherently true, and therefore holding that the supernatural claims made within the Bible are also true. But just like all the supernatural claims made in every single holy book from all around the world, claims and books, by the way, that you and your fellow evangelicals reject out of hand, while also special pleading for the truth of your particular chosen book, they're just claims that cannot be determined to have actually occurred. Remember, AC, there are far older supernatural claims, older by millennia, that have survived to modern day, and those claims are as equally verifiable and valid as the supernatural claims made within the Bible.
On a fella, the Bible says the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, "He is possessed by Beelzebub. By the prince of demons, he cast out the demons." And Christ does make a great response to that. I'd recommend reading Luke 11, Matthew 9, or Mark 3.
Read them, wasn't impressed. But again, AC, citing the Bible to prove the claims in the Bible is just begging the question. You cannot cite the source of the claim as evidence for the claim. For example, I could claim that utilizing supernatural powers gifted to me by a supernatural entity allowed me to conjure and tame a unicorn. Then I could go on to convince some gullible individual that that claim was true, and then I could convince them to write it down in, say, the Book of JL. And just because that book existed and may have been passed down through generations and someone could reference it for the claim that I made does not indicate that the claim was initially true. Now, do the McDowells, or by extension yourself, have any actual evidence to present?
It is highly unlikely that the gospel writers or their Christian sources would volunteer this way of explaining away Jesus' miracles. We therefore consider it certain that first century Jewish critics of Christianity claimed that Jesus performed miracles by the devil.
This can actually go two ways. Because the ancient Jewish people believed that magic was indeed a real thing and that people could utilize magic in order to affect others, so if the events depicted in the Bible actually did take place, of course Jesus' critics would claim that the magic he was utilizing came from an evil entity in order to draw people away from what they saw as a heretical faith and the worship of a false god. But if in fact the events did not happen as depicted, it would still make sense that the stories that the authors eventually wrote down would include Jesus' critics making claims that his miracles were the work of the devil. Unfortunately, neither of those on their face is evidence of Jesus performing miracles, because ultimately it's just another claim following the original claim. From a narrative perspective in regards to the hero cycle, it makes perfect sense, but it still doesn't count as evidence.
First century historian Josephus,
who not only never met Christ nor witnessed anything he purportedly did, but likely hadn't been born yet at the time of the purported crucifixion, which relegates anything Josephus might have written to more hearsay.
in the Antiquities of Josephus.
That's the Antiquities of the Jews, not the Antiquities of Josephus. It appears performing off the cuff might not suit you, AC, which is probably a good sign that you should start doing some actual research and start scripting this stuff out ahead of time.
Did note in a passage which is not disputed.
Actually, the Testimonium Flavianum is highly disputed, and rightfully so, as it was found by biblical scholars to be heavily influenced by Christian interpolation, meaning that other unnamed authors came along after the fact and added in additional information to alter the nature of the passages. For more information on how we can determine such things, check out stylometric analysis.
Meaning that no one disputes that he wrote this passage. Did note that Jesus was a worker of amazing deeds. Jesus' miracles revealed then that he was more than a teacher or a prophet.
Yeah, that's the Testimonium Flavianum, and it's been under dispute for some time now. So much so that some biblical scholars have concluded that almost nothing of what Josephus originally wrote still remains in that passage.
All of Jesus' followers and people who were not his followers agreed that Jesus was performing miracles in the first century.
All claims in the Bible and all claims that were repeated by later sources. 3 minutes in, AC, and while you truly have a fistful of claims, you still have yet to present one shred of legitimate evidence.
No dispute. No dispute.
Recheck your scholarly sources there, bud. I think you'll be surprised.
All right. Name another life, another person who's performed miracles and no one has disputed that they perform miracles in their area. It didn't happen.
Still just repeating your claim, AC. Still waiting on that shocking proof you said you have.
Jesus was the only one. Anyway, there are many modern popular theories about Jesus that are completely out of touch with the fact that he did perform miracles like exorcisms and healings.
Those are, of course, equally irrelevant. The amount of people that happen to write something down does not indicate that what they are writing down is true. H.P. Lovecraft, one of my favorite authors and one of my personal inspirations as a writer, opened up the mythos that he created to any writer to use as they see fit before he died, which of course has led to tens of thousands of additions to the narrative world that he built. But this fact, of course, doesn't mean that Cthulhu actually exists.
Notions of Jesus as a teacher of morals or a critic of the establishment are mere attempts to modernize Jesus, make him something fluffy and easy to mentally grasp, right?
Well, if the original conceptualization of Christ and what Christ did is considered too vague or too complex or too rife with contradictions, then it would make sense if future writers who also believed those stories would attempt to salvage the character by making the stories more palatable in their own writings. We see this happen across the board with legendary characters from around the world, from King Arthur to the Monkey King. And while this is of course not evidence for Christ performing miracles, let alone even existing as depicted, it is evidence against the idea that the narrative that was laid down was inspired by an omniscient entity. Because you'd think that an entity that is defined as being perfect and knowing all true propositions would be able to inspire information in a perfect way, meaning that it cannot be interpreted any way than what it is, and would account and reconcile all of the false propositions out there, entailing that any future interpolations, extrapolations, or adjustments would not only be unnecessary, but would in fact be impossible given their divine precision.
It's not easy for us to grasp, and then we say it's nonsense because our small minds can't comprehend something.
Again, you'd think that an omniscient entity, having purposefully designed humans to have such tiny brains and such terrible reasoning, would have had the foreknowledge to convey information in such a way that it could be readily understood by any human being at any point in history. But that, of course, is assuming that the entity exists at all, ignores all the problematic logical entailments of its existence, and does not take into account the logical possibility that the antiquity writings of ignorant people that have been constantly interpolated, altered, and translated over a period of 2,000 years might not be the best source of information regarding reality.
Makes me think of the Trinity. Anyway, Jesus never performed miracles to show off. He did not seek to gain anything for himself. His miracles were intimately bound up with his message.
Claim after claim after claim. I do have one question, AC. Do you legitimately think that reading the claims of a particular author regarding the claims made by another author in an ancient book that you already presuppose to be true actually counts as evidence that those claims are true? Or has all of this just been your way of justifying not doing the actual work yourself?
That the kingdom of God was at hand. Jesus' miracles revealed the kingdom of God because Jesus was king
Cool story, Hansel.
himself. So that's how we know that Jesus performed miracles.
No, that's just you reading a book written by a couple of guys who believe the same things that you do and are just repeating ancient claims as if they are true, which not only isn't evidence, but doesn't even translate to knowledge. This is why I said at the start that for Christians, this is a matter of faith, which is absolutely not the same thing as knowledge.
His miracles were undisputed,
Heavily disputed by both his critics and those who had no skin in the game whatsoever.
led to change lives.
Just because a concept can have a positive utility for a person does not indicate that that concept exists as anything more than a concept. And it certainly changed the lives of the millions upon millions of people and families who were tortured and murdered throughout human history in its name.
His resurrection,
Which of course is only a claim as well.
led to his brother who didn't believe he was Christ to then believing he was Christ and then dying.
Also a claim that supports the narrative but cannot be confirmed as something that actually happened.
Which we also have in records of Josephus.
True, the passage about James, Jesus' brother, is regarded by scholarship to have been written by Josephus himself.
His disciples who, well, they wouldn't go to jail for him whenever he was alive.
It's really no surprise that stories written about the followers of a cult by people who were also members of that cult would do everything they could narratively to validate what the cult believes in.
It's pretty obvious if you think about it.
After Jesus was resurrected, would then die for him.
People go to their deaths for all manner of reasons. Just because some individuals believed a concept were true to the point that they were willing to die for it does not indicate that what they believed was true. The only thing that is evidence for is that they believed in it to the extent that they were willing to die for it. But even then, the stories regarding the supposed martyrs are also heavily disputed across the board by scholarship. But regardless of any of that, it's still all just claims upon claims.
So you need the evidence. There's the evidence.
That's not evidence, AC. That's just you repeating Christian mythology. No different than any of the other extra-biblical authors have been doing for 2 millennia.
Argue with that evidence.
Don't need to. I just need to point out exactly how it isn't evidence because it's just you repeating claims.
provide some counter explanations for why the apostles completely changed.
The same reason anybody changes their behavior when they join any cult. They've been convinced that a particular thing is true, and thus they alter their behavior to reflect that belief. All you have to do is take a look at the Mormons, Scientologists, Branch Davidians, Heaven's Gate, NXIVM, or any other cult in history to understand this phenomenon.
Why they grew so much in courage upon the death of Jesus, if you don't believe in his resurrection.
The same could be said for any member of any cult at any time. It's basic human psychology. They believe that they have the right information and everybody else does not, because they've been convinced of that, and that makes them feel special.
Where's the counterpoint for why they would go to their death?
As I said, look at any death cult in history and why exactly their members were willing to die for their beliefs.
Frankly, there isn't one. Where's the counterpoint for why Paul would go from stoning Christians to becoming one and being martyred himself?
Well, the experience on the road to Damascus is a little different because in that story, whether you argue that it's God or an angel or even Christ, this entity literally appears before Saul itself, thus giving him the irrefutable knowledge of its existence, thus logically warranting a change in his behavior. And arguments for potential violations of free will or how this entity could logically give everyone on the planet a similar experience aside, again, it's just another story, thus it's just another claim in the Bible.
By Nero in 62, which we have Roman historical sources showing that.
Well, it's alleged that Saul may have been among the Christians who were persecuted by Nero after the Great Fire in 64 CE, but of course that claim can also not be confirmed to any real degree of certainty.
The proof is there, the proof is out there. Christ is king, and every knee will bow.
No, it isn't. That's a claim, and knees don't bow, they bend.
Bend the knee.
Bend the knee. Bend the knee. Bend the knee.
Bend the knee.
Bend the knee. Bend the knee.
And bend the knee. Bend the knee. You bend the knee. You
Bend the knee.
bend the knee. Bend the knee. Bend the knee.
Bend the knee. Bend the knee.
But that does warrant another question for you, AC. If your God were to actually exist, I personally would not find it worthy of worship. Worthy of my utter contempt, yes, but certainly not worship. So, if I were to die and suddenly find myself in front of this thing, I can readily and steadfastly assure you that no bowing of my own free will be taking place. As my own parents instilled in me, might does not make right, and capitulating to bullies only gives them more power. So the question is, if your God actually exists, then it's logically entailed it knows this fact about me. So, would forcing me to bow before it be a violation of my free will? Because anything that would have to utilize its power to force my subservience is of course not worthy of that subservience.
I am the Lord, your God.
You're not God.
Yes, I am, Jesus.
For the future, AC, I strongly recommend that you dive into the actual literature and the bodies of work of the scholars who have made this stuff their life's work. Obviously, taking the word of people as fact just because they believe the same thing that you do is nothing more than self-validation through confirmation bias and is certainly not a pathway to truth. And a terrific way to bridge the divide is to do the actual work yourself, so that we can ensure that when we dive into these topics, we both know we're starting on the same page, and can therefore enjoy a more productive conversation instead of just talking past one another. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, February is Heart Awareness Month. A link on how you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 5th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear, an official Darth, Dawkins Squeak toy, or support the podcast is down in the description. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together, we can bridge the divide.